If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read it, you're misinformed. What is the long-term effect of too much information?
Information, I just need some information. I've been dying. Is it lack of education? I've been reading without any transformation. I'm addicted. Is it overstimulation? Hey.
Welcome to the Sixth Sense.
Hear ye. Come on. You are listening to the Sixth Sense Report with Joel Nikoloff and Darnell Samuels.
Might have been the longest first syllable I've ever heard out of you. I like it. Extra enunciation.
Is that the first time I've done?
No, I'm just saying it was like an extra half second, just a little extra punch on the here.
Oh yeah, no man, I'm excited. I'm excited to jump into this topic. Although we've covered it twice before. You said episode 2,
episode 3,
episode 3,
and 3 is like literally this is a part 2 to episode 3, which I was super excited about. You're like, hey, you want to talk about this? And I was like, yeah, follow up to episode 3 of our podcast.
Episode 3, but then we also covered in episode 24 morality and immigration. What was episode 3 called?
Illegal border crossing crisis, hacking the Canadian asylum process. So if you want to have a good understanding of this Quebec asylum issue, I think that episode is probably a good place that you could go back to 2017. December 2017 is when it came out, and maybe understand when the rise in these border crossings started and sort of the rhetoric that was going on. And I think a lot of the conversation we had at the time would be foundational for this as well. Maybe a little bit overlap, but I think we do touch on the nuance or the specifics of this particular illegal border crossing location in Quebec.
Yes. Now, but what's different from this episode to the others is we'll try to give more of a focus on the human rights issue as it relates to illegal immigrants being detained, right? So I was working on a lesson, and I was like, okay, let me quickly Google find, because I'm doing a lesson on human rights, positive rights, negative rights, inalienable rights, property rights. All
Sounds
that.
like your students are getting a good education.
Oh, well, it depends who you ask. Who you ask. But so I was like, okay, well, let's put it in our context. What's some human rights issues we're seeing today in Canada? And one that popped up, I was kind of like, wait, what? I didn't realize this was actually an issue. It was immigration detention. And so it says the Canadian federal government adopted new policy regulations in 2018 that require children to be held in immigration detention as a last resort. Although the number of detained children has decreased over the years, the average time they spent in detention facilities rose, highlighting the structural issues of immigration that continue to plague Canada. Furthermore, despite the introduction to the National Immigration Framework in 2016, Canada has seen a rising trend in immigration detainees in prisons in 2019. The Canadian Border Services agencies detained 7,212 people in immigration holding centers, which is up from 6,609 people in 2017. So yeah, let's talk about it. Let's talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, my first annoyance with this conversation, or maybe annoyance, I'm annoyed with something that I think creates a need to clarify something. And that is to call, like, it was a bit of a conflating of terms on purpose. Immigration generally refers to the application and approval to move into another country. Well, when you just show up at the border, assuming you're not a refugee, you're not immigrating. You're vacationing. Now, again, I'm being a little, particular in my words, because the system itself has different categories, and we, I think there's an intentional sort of pulling on heartstrings when you refer to everybody who tries to come into the country as an immigrant. But illegal immigration are those who didn't follow the proper channels to get in the country, and now they're being detained. And so, that's calling it immigration detainees is like you're playing word games, right? Illegal border crossings being detained, or border crossers being detained,
Mhm.
doesn't sound as, heartstring pulling when identifying that they're doing something criminal or illegal, which is what led to the detain process, or being detained. Because,
Right.
had they tried to do the asylum process, which was, let's call it, I came here on a flight with my relatives and then tried to come and claim asylum, as a, whether refugee or not, that's a different thing, right? And you're likely not to be detained. You got in the country under maybe a false pretense, but you were allowed in. You may have had alternative motives, i.e., you came here for a vacation for your relative and then chose never to leave and then applied for asylum. Generally, you're not getting arrested. Now, you could end up being detained because you end up qualifying as an illegal immigrant at some point because you're in this country illegally. But the problem is we want, or some people want to play word games where no, everybody who's here who isn't a Canadian citizen is an immigrant. They're just in process. And so it's just a matter of semantics sometimes, because it doesn't allow for an honest, transparent, detailed conversation about, well, what is the right way to do things? What is the right way to handle this situation? Right? What happens when we have an asylum seeker in this context? What happens in this context? No, we're just going to call it immigration detainee human rights issue. Now, again, I know I'm being a little particular or a little bit, poignant in my points, but it's so irritating because we don't end up having a real conversation, because this nuance matters. And just pulling on people's heartstrings is a manner of getting what you want, not deciding what the right solution is. Right? They've already predetermined that everybody should just be able to come here. The person who wants to call every illegal border crosser a human rights violation when they've been detained. Right? But a human rights violation is that you've acted in a manner that violates the rights of the citizen, arguably. If you're not a Canadian citizen, does the Canadian Constitution qualify for you?
Mhm.
Simple answer is you can't get in the country during the last 2 years if you didn't have a Canadian citizenship. American citizens can't just walk in the country in the last 2 years when we had the border shut down.
Mhm.
There are differences. But we're playing word games because we don't want to have a real conversation, because that's difficult. And maybe some conclusions that we don't like end up being achieved or reached. Instead, it's just everybody being let in. And if we arrest them, that's human rights violation. No, they should just let them continue to walk the streets. Right? Is that the alternative? I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but that seems to be what's presented as the alternative. And I don't want to straw man. I'm trying to say that because of the words we use, we don't have a real conversation.
Mhm.
Or
Mhm.
here's the conversation.
Yeah. No, I hear what you're saying. It's funny. I remember when I was at Sheridan College, and I was in the correctional worker program. So corrections is working in jails, and
Different kind of teaching.
Pardon?
It's a different kind of teaching.
Yeah, but it still has its connections to teaching in the school. But anyways, so when I was at Sheridan College for corrections, we do placements and stuff like that, and we do site visits. So you go to some facilities around Ontario, like Maplehurst, or back in the day it was Metro West Detention Center. And so we got to, get tours of these jails and get a feel for what it's like on the inside. And there's one of those. I think I was at Maplehurst, and there was a guy sitting in the cell, and I said, and I just said, I said, hey, what are you in for? And the guy said, immigration. He was Jamaican, right? He's like, yeah, immigration. And I was like, and you also was like, what? I was like, how? What the heck? To this day, for years, that always stuck with me. I was like, wait, how the heck could you be in jail for immigration issues, unless whatever the case may be? And now it makes sense that what ends up happening is people come to the border. There's like a border. You come in through New York. And then you cross into Quebec, and it's just like this little ditch you walk across. And
yeah, it's not a border crossing. When Darna says a border, it's like the line they drew in the sand on the map.
Yeah,
that you just chose to walk over because there's nobody protecting it.
Yeah,
right. Let's just be clear.
Yeah,
the whole episode 3. We hashed this out.
And so what ends up happening is people will their visa might expire in the U.S. And then they'll get a taxi ride to that border, and they'll walk across. But before they come across, there's a border person, a border officer standing at that border, and they'll say, "Hey, look, are you trying to come to Canada? Because if you cross here, you're coming into Canada." And the person will say yes. They're like, "Okay, well, if you do, then you will be arrested, just to let you know." And the people will be like, "Okay. I'm gonna take my chances." So they go. So with that said, what ends up happening is you have the Canada Border Services Agency. They have facilities. They have 3 major facilities that hold detention centers that hold illegal immigrants as they're waiting for their papers to be processed, right? So the idea is like, okay, do you have the correct paperwork? Do you have a correct identity? Because if you come in here, we don't really have your identity. We got to figure out who you are. So that process has to happen. So you'll be waiting in detention, right? Because it wouldn't make sense to let them into the country and disappear, so to speak. So the idea is they keep them in detention. So now what ends up happening is that there becomes a backlog as people try to flee to the country, right? So when we think about like the war in the Ukraine and so forth, right? You're kind of like, okay, well, there's tons of people trying to come over from there, or whatever the case may be. So in 2017, there was a tweet, January 20th, 2017, Justin Trudeau tweeted this tweet. To those fleeing persecution, terror, and war, Canadians will welcome you, regardless of your faith. Diversity is our strength. # welcome to Canada. And so I was watching a bunch of documentaries about people coming to Canada illegally through this border. What's that border called again?
It's Roxham Road.
What's it called?
Roxham Road.
Roxham Road. Yeah, Roxham Road. Coming through Roxham, New York, into Quebec. And so this is where people are trying to come through. So the idea is that now a lot of the immigrants in the documentary we were saying, or the assumption is that, hey, Canada is the land of milk and honey, and it will fix all my problems. And one guy was just like, look, man, I have a lot of problems. I can't go back to my country. I'm a refugee. But Canada is going to fix all my problems because, and then the journalist that has a mic in the person's face, they're like, oh, so what did you think? Are you, do you have doubts that Canada will accept you? They're like, doubts. They looked at her like she was crazy. They're like, doubts? What do you mean? Canada doesn't turn anybody away. Right. So they were like, man, this news reporter, is she crazy? And she's like, what makes you think they won't turn you away? She's like, well, because I'm not going anywhere. And there's tons of people who've done this and gotten through. Now, for the listeners who are thinking about this whole process, the people who are coming in illegally, they're not jumping the line. So those people who are coming legally versus those who are coming illegally. The people who are illegal aren't jumping the line and getting in ahead of them or getting their paperwork done. It's just that sometimes for those people who don't have the paperwork, if you come to the border and the correct border, the proper border, and you don't have the proper paperwork, you're just going to get sent back. Versus you come in illegally, and you'll be detained and you'll be held here, and then you'll be processed, and they'll check your health stuff. They'll check your paperwork to find out your identity. Now, with all that said, what ends up happening with persecution across the world and Trudeau making these statements and in Canada being promoted as the land of milk and honey, it creates a backlog because people start coming in illegally. Right, people start coming in illegally,
and that was the
backlog. And then those people, then a lot of times, because those detention center, those detaining centers are full, those people will go into the overflow into the medium security jails, right, and they'll be held there. And I guess that's where I saw that gentleman that one time, like he was just being held there, waiting for his paperwork to be processed.
Okay. Yeah. So he's and this is the dilemma, right? Like, you know. Again, go back to my criticism of this conversation. Calling it, putting them in prison becomes a human rights violation, when it's like the alternative is to let them roam the country without even processing them at all. Like that's all arguably. I would think a lot of people would go, well,
or we take our tax money and build bigger facilities.
Yeah, but that's a long-term solution, not and when you're in a short-term scenario, like that's not a viable solution.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is my point that, like, again, it's a heartstrings pull when you talk about human rights, but it's not a productive solution because all of the ways to resolve are, just let them in and do nothing. Like, again, I'm oversimplifying it, but like,
no, I hear what you're saying. So, and we talked about this already, sort of, kind of.
So I want to say one thing. You said they didn't jump the line, and you're not wrong, but you're also slightly wrong, because what they're doing is they're changing lines. Asylum is a different method of applying for, let's call it, residency in Canada. Immigration is the method of applying when you're not in the country.
Right.
So asylum seek, you essentially go, you know what? I'm not having any luck with this method. I'm going to try another way, get in the country illegally, and then apply for asylum. Now, there could be people crossing and getting their, immigration papers processed as well. I'll just, say that that's possible. But generally, it's sort of them choosing a different method of getting into the country than applying for immigrant status.
Right.
The second piece was on our first episode. The issue with a refugee is the way the world, I think it's WHO, or, how they get allocated refugees. Whatever country you're allocated to is the country you apply for refugee status. This is an example of people going to the US and going, no, I don't want refugee status here. And they're shopping for countries by illegally coming into Canada and now applying for refugee status under the asylum program. So again, there's an aspect that they're hacking the system. That's why, part of the title in the original. And so they aren't, I think your point is why you're right, is that they're not pushing those who are already in the queue back in the queue. It's not forcing others to take longer to get their immigration processed.
Yeah. And then, it comes back to, why do asylum seekers leave the US for Canada? Right. I think of
the land of milk and honey, right? That's what
I think of the classic Eddie Murphy movie Coming to America, right? The American Dream, right? People want to come to Canada, but it was crazy. But people were like, yeah, nah. The journalist was asking them, yeah, so why don't you just stay in America? Like, what? Hey, man, Canada's way better. And Joel and I, we did an episode on is Canada a socialist country? And if you're on the outside looking in and you're in a war-torn country, man, Canada looks pretty darn good.
Yep.
It looks pretty darn good, right? And we got a lot of social services, a lot of security blankets, so a lot of people can regroup, get back on their feet, and there's a lot of immigrants who've done that. But to answer your point about me being wrong about them jumping the line in a different line, I was watching another documentary where people where people who were coming illegally were complaining that they were being mistreated, of course, being detained, and
I committed
their
a crime and they didn't treat me well. Anyways.
and their yeah and their process being rejected, their claims being rejected and being
And then they
sent
get
back.
sent home.
And
Yeah.
right, and so a lot of times Canada had to send ambassadors to other countries to go talk to people and say, hey, look, man, like even on the Canada government website, like there's a video that's saying, hey, look, if you come in illegally, this nice well-dressed black man, you know, with a flag behind him saying, hey, look, my people, if you try to come in here illegally, we have rules and there is due process. And if you come in here and you're claiming refugee status and you're really not a refugee, meaning that you can't prove that
You're persecuted
really
in your
being
home country.
persecuted. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you can't really prove that, then we will send you back. And so sometimes people think that that is, as we say in the streets, it's sweet over here. It's sweet here in Canada that we're soft and that people will just come in illegally and we'll let you in. And so people are getting rejected. And then Trudeau had to come out and make some statements and to kind of walk back his statements about like, hey, the party's over here, all are invited. And he had to walk back those statements and say, hey, look, we have due process. If you come in here illegally, you don't have the proper paperwork and you can't prove that you are a refugee being persecuted, we will send you home.
Yeah, and this is where, what's happened, interestingly enough, to sort of this is where the second part of, let's call it the first show, is, Ottawa is having this issue with Quebec because Quebec is getting the abundance of asylum seekers on their, soil, sort of as a starting point. And so, the question, like I have the article here from CBC, and the headline is "Send all asylum seekers to other provinces." Quebec Premier tells Trudeau, and this is from February of 2023. And so, his perspective is that Quebec has done its fair share of, let's say, handling most of these,
right.
Especially again, the article in 2017 was the end of 2017, largely due to Trudeau's tweet at the beginning of 2017. And I would say, all the Trump hoopla was leading a lot of people to being concerned that they wouldn't get immigration status.
Right. Yep.
And so they were rushing into Canada.
Right.
And so, the article that when we did that one, it was like the numbers were doubling and tripling every month. Like I think even as high as like 10x some months, the amount of people coming over the border. So I don't know the numbers. I don't see any, big numbers here. Although he did say, in 2022, it roughly exploded with 39,000 irregular entries, in addition to about the 20,000 regular entries with regards to Quebec. So, they basically had to triple their immigration number, it sounds like, through this, irregular crossings. And so, yeah, it's just it's an interesting aspect where we're just letting it happen, right? Like, nobody wants to build a wall, of course. That has problems, being tied to Trump and all. But it's, it's a problem that we don't, again, I would say we're not having real conversations about. We're not having real conversation about how do we solve this problem, right? Like maybe the problem is partially the nature of the system where it's very, very slow, which is, a government problem. So, I mean, to answer the question simply, it sort of goes, why doesn't Quebec stop the problem rather than passing the problem on to others, right? Like if I wanted to, push back on Quebec, I go, well, why don't you stop them from coming in? Why do I have to take the immigrants or the illegal immigrants into my province if you're the province that's letting them in? Why don't you just stop letting them in? Again, I'm being a little bit, I'm presenting what other provinces could be saying back to them. Like, why is it our problem? You're the one who's got the border problem, right? I think Alberta or BC, there's one of the borders up there. There's large places where the borders are unmanned. And so there's other places across the Canadian border all across the country where you could have a similar problem because we don't have a wall between Canada and the US.
Yes.
And so, yeah, just, I mean, my 2 cents on this is that, like, it's a Quebec problem because they're illegally crossing into Quebec. So solve the problem. Seems pretty apparent. Partially because the other provinces, not all of them, but many of the other provinces could have a similar problem. I mean, Ontario's blessed because our border is basically ocean.
Right.
Or
And
I shouldn't say ocean, lakes.
and that's a good point. But one of the US officers in one of the documentaries I was watching, he was saying that, like, yeah, like that Roxham Road, was it Roxham Road?
Roxham Road, I think so.
Yeah. So there's a lot of people, a lot of officers, a lot of attention at that spot. But he says, yeah, but there's a lot more of the border that's not being protected, right? Where people are just like, you know what, I won't go through this way. I'll just cut through the next way, and do it that way. But yeah, you make a good point, Joel, about yeah, like if it's Quebec's issue. But I think also, like, from the top down, right? Like our federal government, we
Yeah.
like Trudeau's made it clear that, hey, look, come on through, if you can, if you're really running from danger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, again, if I want to steel man Quebec's position, they might say, well, Ottawa is forcing us to let them in, so why do we have to bear the burden when we can't stop them? And in that case, they would have a fair point. If Ottawa's, but I assume, I don't know why you wouldn't be able to be like, no, I'm just going to put up a wall here. Like, if the cost of this is less than a wall, why wouldn't you stop the problem?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So
what's your 2 cents on the issue?
Well, I think, I think the last question that we didn't really touch is really where my 2 cents lies, which is open border versus closed border policy. And you touched on, we have the previous episode where we discussed, is Canada socialist? And the amount of programs that we have is part of the dilemma. And so I would say to you, I think I'm very much a pro open borders concept, but like no government programs, period. And part of the open borders concept is like, if somebody is giving you a place to stay, why can't you come? Like, just as an oversimplification, like if I was going to bring an immigrant into my home and provide essentially room and board, then this is where the open border policy concept sort of starts to make sense, because it's like, well, they already have a place to go, so why can't they just come in? It's, them ending up on the streets or ending up on government programs, paying and tax dollars having to take care of them, where I think the open border policy runs into potential problems, or is going to have problems, because if 1 million immigrants showed up here tomorrow and they all wanted to be on welfare, Canada would be bankrupt, right? You'd be like 1/40th of our population it has to be paid for on top of what we already have, right? Like, so, my 2 cents on this is that so much of it is because we just have a very, government sort of programs based system that there's just potential problems that we can't. An open border policy is just inherently impossible, because the number of people could become very problematic. Again, assuming they're getting all of these government programs. If they came in here with no government programs, I mean, I'm of the view that the more people, the more prosperous we become, because you have more specialization of labor, you have more you have more trade, more commerce. But again, this is under a free market sort of paradigm with less government intervention, less social programs, less government, providing for everybody, which means less taxation. And so, my view on immigration and borders is so nuanced. It's, it's very hard to put me in a box, because under a current paradigm, I have, concerns, because we're just potentially bringing in, poor scenarios. Now, the counter argument, or if I was to go back to, like, let's call it historical immigration, that was very much like, well, yeah, sure, we'll bring in a doctor. They can help and, make us better off, right? Like, very much a lot of the immigration in the past was was somewhat of a brain drain to poorer countries. And so it's sort of, a rebuttal to myself to some extent that, as much as the old systems were, let's call it merit based for a lot of obviously we had refugees plus immigration, so not only merit based, but the merit based system sort of keeps third world countries third world because we take all their, intelligence to some extent. So I think that immigration is a very complex issue. And so, this is what frustrates me, that when I go back to the very start of the show where I went on the tirade, because it's just, we sort of box ourselves into this particular conversation, and we can't have an honest conversation with the nuance. And, a good example, what is the proper response when our detention centers are over full, right? What are the options available? What is the most humane is the proper question, not, well, if you do this, it's a human rights violation because, and it's just a tokenist sort of response. So, Darnell, what about you? What's your 2 cents?
Okay, so my 2 cents is, as I was, doing some research on it, and I was reading this book. What is this book called? According to the Bible, a comprehensive resource for understanding modern political issues in light of Scripture by Wayne Grudem.
I'm assuming that's a bit more of a reference book than a leisurely read.
Yeah. It's more of a reference book, and so in it, he references this gentleman who named James Hofmer. He wrote this book called Immigration Crisis, and he's an Old Testament scholar. And he says, like, the scriptures make a distinction between illegal immigrants and legal immigrants. And I was like, what are they talking about? Right. So Exodus chapter 22, verse 21, and it says, "You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt." And so the word alien, which you'll see in your NIV, sojourner or stranger, which you'll see in your ESV, NASB, or KJV, those terms are those who are legal. So alien, sojourner, stranger, those terms are for legal immigrants, and you should welcome them and treat them right and so forth. And then the term for illegal immigrant is foreigner. Foreigner is for illegal immigrants. And so he's arguing that for the foreigner, it's kind of a different situation, because the scriptures are teach across the board. You see this throughout history, not just in Israel, but every nation. They protect borders. Right. Right. They're very serious about protecting their borders, obviously, in their historical context. And so when you get a foreigner coming in, if the foreigner comes in and the foreigner is not coming in the correct way, then
they're a spy.
Yeah, you don't know versus the person who the sojourner, the person who comes in legally through the front door of the kingdom rather than jumping the wall. Right. You're going to get treated. You're going to get treated differently if you jump the wall. And so, like I mentioned before, with what Trudeau making the announcement, and people across the world seeing Canada as a blank check, and us getting the influx of all these illegal immigrants. Personally, I think that the Canada Border Services Agency is doing the best they can do under the circumstances Trudeau has put them under. Right. So the border rules are there to maintain safety and order. Right. So when these people come to the border, the officer asks them, "Hey, look, if you cross that line, we will arrest you." And then in the documentary I saw, the people were like, "Yes, I'm going to cross the line. I understand what you're saying. Let's do this, Brutus." They cross over, they get arrested. There is no injustice there, and they're going to take the risk.
They know
the opportunity cost. The opportunity cost. You're like, you know what? It's either I stay back there or I get detained here and then and then see what happens. And by God's grace, you'll make it through. That's my 2 cents.
No, that's good, man. I appreciate that. It's it makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, and obviously the times are a lot different, and so you need to tease the principles out a lot better. But I think actually a smaller community makes it clearer, right? Like if you use the example of a kingdom, right? And I don't know why my mind sort of went to Jericho, but like, you know, when you have the walled garden in a sense, or you know, that walled area, when someone comes in a secretive manner versus a transparent manner, is sort of the biblical things that I'm sort of teasing out from what you've said, right? And how you would treat them differently. And so, yeah, I sort of appreciate that Grudem makes that point. I'm sure some Christians might disagree with that exegesis. I don't think, and I think when I say that, I don't think that they have a basis to really disagree that there's a difference. I think that they would try to argue it doesn't apply.
Yeah, well,
because
if you disagree and you say it doesn't
inconvenient
apply, if you say it doesn't agree, then you know where to find us at sixcentsreport@gmail.com. Let us know your 2 cents. Hit us up on our Facebook group, Instagram, Twitter. You know where to find us.
Madden and Mitchell Media.